So if you're watching this video, odds are you have a friend, a family member, a loved one, or maybe even just an acquaintance who has decided to give Brightline eating a try. And you're curious maybe what they're up to, and maybe you'd like to learn a little bit more about the background of why it's working for them and why it's important to them. And maybe you'd like to know a little bit about how you could best support them in their endeavors. So that's what I'm here to share with you a little bit about. I'm Susan Peirce Thompson, and I'm going to be talking with you for the next little while from several perspectives. A scientific perspective. I have a PhD in brain and cognitive sciences, so I like to talk about the neuroscience and psychology of how sustained weight loss really works. But I'm also going to be sharing with you from a personal perspective and an experiential perspective, because I myself have been doing Brightline eating for over a dozen years, and I've helped hundreds, maybe thousands of people to lose their excess weight using this method. And so I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about the experiences I've had doing it myself, helping my friends and family members understand why it works for me, and helping the people that I work with to explain to their friends and family members what they're doing. So you might have some questions. I'm hoping that I will address a lot of them in this video. So first of all, before we really launch in, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about what's going on with your loved one who is doing Brightline eating. And I hope I answer a lot of your questions in this video. So let's get started. The first question that you might have is, doesn't this seem a bit extreme? Why do we have to be using these bright lines? And why can't a path of moderation work for my loved one? You might use a path of moderation for your own eating. And the reason that moderation doesn't work very well for everybody, but it works for some people, is that people genuinely differ when it comes to food. And I think one of the most helpful ways to think of this difference is along something that I like to call the susceptibility scale. So the susceptibility scale is a scale, a continuum, that goes from 0 or 1 on the low end up to 10 on the high end. And on the low end of this scale, you've got people, perhaps like yourself, who don't think about food a lot in between meals, and when they do start to eat, they naturally get satisfied and lose interest in eating, and then they're not obsessed with food in between times. On the high end of the scale, though, it's like living in a different universe. The people who are up here on the scale experience profound hunger and cravings, and even to the point of obsession with food in between meals. And when they start to eat, they often experience a lack of control around how much they eat. So while their body might be saying, you've had enough food, you're full, you can stop now, their brain and their mouth are saying more, 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 and they eat past the point of fullness, past the point of rationality, past the point of sanity. And there's a feeling of lack of control about that can often be quite scary. And they often think about food too much in between meals. And if you just think of the whole sort of life's energy, life's focus, too much of their life's focus is spent on what they've eaten or not eaten, whether they are or aren't sticking with their food plan, how much they have or haven't exercised. That whole juggernaut is just too all-consuming. And it's frankly exhausting, and so they look for a path to solve that problem. And conventional diets tend not to work very well for them because they're high on the susceptibility scale, which means that they're especially susceptible to the addictive pull of refined foods. And as scientists, we know a lot now about which foods it is that create that addictive susceptibility. So let's talk about that a little bit. So the two foods that cause this addictive craving in individuals who are high on the susceptibility scale are sugar and flour. And if you think about it, these foods are not naturally occurring substances. They're derived from naturally occurring substances, but they are refined and processed to a point that is completely unnatural. And in fact, they are processed just like heroin and cocaine are processed. I don't know if you've thought deeply about what exactly heroin and cocaine are, right? These are clearly our two most canonical drugs of abuse, heroin and cocaine, and they both come from plant substances that are innocuous on their own. You can eat the leaves off a coca plant or ingest poppy plants and it's not going to hurt you. But if you take the inner essence of those plants and refine and purify that inner essence into a fine white, or in the case of heroin, brown powder, you now have a drug of abuse. And sugar and flour are produced in exactly that way. They take the inner essence of a plant substance, whether it's the sugarcane plant or corn or beets or wheat or rye, or you name the plant substance, and you refine and purify it into a fine white or brown powder, and you have a substance that is not naturally occurring in the world. And there is now a very large body of scientific research that shows that these substances, sugar and flour, hit the brain and hijack it in the same way that drugs of abuse like heroin and cocaine hijack the brain. As a matter of fact, Dr. Mark Hyman is famous for saying it turns out that sugar is 8 times more powerful in its addictive force than cocaine. And if that sounds a little extreme to you, I'd like to propose to you that last year alone, 80,000 people in just America had a limb amputated because they couldn't stop eating those substances from type 2 diabetes. 80,000 people. Now, these are people who knew it was coming. And I don't know about you, but I don't know anybody who willingly walks into a limb amputation, or the other 25,000 people who went blind because of their type 2 diabetes, who knew it was coming. Their eyesight is going, and they cannot stop eating these foods. It is absolutely not an exaggeration to say that these foods are powerfully addictive. So the bottom line is that sugar and flour are just as, if not more, addictive than our classic drugs of abuse, and we have fMRI studies that show this. We have rodent studies that show this. We have human trials that show this. And we're talking about a thinning of the dopamine receptors and the nucleus accumbens. It's called dopamine downregulation in the part of the brain that is the addictive center of the brain. And sugar and flour cause it, just like cocaine and heroin cause it. And so there you are. So this is why a path of moderation does not work for some people. Just like some people are powerfully susceptible to addiction in other ways, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or heroin or cocaine, other people are powerfully susceptible to the addictive pull of refined foods. The best analogy here is cigarette smoking. So if you take a look at someone who is addicted to cigarettes, it's not that easy for them to just moderate or cut down their nicotine consumption. What's easier for them is to quit smoking altogether. And even though no one would say quitting smoking is easy, I've done it, it's not easy at all. That is the easier path than a path of moderation. If you're addicted to something, oftentimes you just are going to have to quit it. And so that's the foundational philosophy, very much grounded in science, that bright line eating comes from, is that for some people, just quitting these substances is easier than trying to moderate intake. So another question you might have is, why plan your food and why weigh and measure your food? Isn't that a little bit unnecessary? Why don't you just get rid of sugar and flour and leave it at that? And the answer is that for some people, having really clear boundaries around how much to eat and what to eat is as important as eating the right foods. For some of us, it actually produces a feeling of freedom. Those of us who have battled and wrestled and dealt for so long and spent so much energy trying to control how much we were eating and eat the right amount, it's actually freeing to just put our food on a digital food scale and know that we're getting the right amount. There's also evidence that for people who are high on the susceptibility scale, quantities of food can be just as addictive as sugar and flour. So it's very important that we get the quantities right, and that's why using a digital food scale is a really good idea. Now, some of you with all of this going on, this weighing and measuring and the no sugar and no flour, might be hoping deep down that your loved one will just be able to start eating normally again once they've lost their weight or once they've been doing bright line eating for a long period of time. And while it's certainly anyone's choice to decide whether they want to do bright line eating on any given day, and in the future your loved one might decide not to do it anymore, who knows what the future holds. In general, what I see from over a decade of working with people doing bright line eating is when people stop doing the habits and behaviors that work for them in the beginning, they lose the feeling of freedom and the physical success, the weight loss that they were enjoying so much when they were doing Bright Line eating. So it's kind of like, again, back to the smoking, which I do think is really the best analogy here. Once someone quits smoking, odds are they're not going to be successful long term if they enter a period where they start to dabble with taking a drag of a cigarette at a party, buying a pack but only smoking it on the weekends. That's probably not a formula for success. The best formula for success if you're quitting smoking is just not to ever smoke again. And it's similar with Bright Line eating. So even after years and years and years of being on the Bright Line eating plan, returning to eating sugar or flour or returning to unmeasured quantities of food can start to slowly unravel all the progress that was made. So what I've found, and what a lot of the people that I work with have found, is that sticking with it long term produces by far the best results and the most long-term freedom. The freedom can actually be so profound that I have a little tagline for it. I call it being happy, thin, and free. And while weight loss is a big part of the equation for a lot of people who do Bright Line eating, I know it was for me. I used to be obese, believe it or not. And when I started doing Bright Line eating, I lost 60 pounds in 6 months and shrank from a size 16 down to a size 4. And I've been now in a size 4 body for the better part of coming up on 12 years. But believe it or not, weight loss is not high on the list of priorities for everybody who tries Bright Line eating. It really is for some people, but research shows that 17% of people who are lean, slender, of a normal weight are actually extremely high on the susceptibility scale. So you have a contingent of the normal weight population who, even though they don't manifest it on their body, are obsessed with food, distraught about their relationship with food, feeling that lack of control when they eat, not feeling satisfied when they eat, and just spending way too much of their time mentally jiggering and figuring with what they've eaten or not eaten and so forth. And for these individuals, Bright Line eating is often the breath of fresh air that they've been looking for. So I work with a lot of people who come to me at a normal weight, and weight loss is not their goal, but freedom from food obsession is their goal. So if you have a loved one in your life who's not overweight, but they're drawn to doing Bright Line eating, I just hope and encourage you to support them because what they're really looking for is freedom from food obsession. And that is the sort of gold standard that we try to offer here at Bright Line Eating Solutions is happy, thin, and free with an emphasis on the free. Freedom from food obsession. So we talk about feeling free, but my guess is that for you watching us, you're thinking that we're in prison. Because for people who are not on the high end of the susceptibility scale, watching someone conform to a life pattern where they're weighing and measuring every morsel that they eat and never eating sugar and flour, even on birthdays, holidays, and special occasions, sounds like being in jail. And I want to assure you that for your loved one who's tried Bright Line eating, it's better than the alternative. And it's probably not as bad as you're thinking it is. Now, just don't get me wrong, it's hard at first. Just like quitting smoking is hard. I'm not going to promise that your friend or loved one is, just happy, thin, and free from day one every single day from then on. But I will say that just like quitting smoking, if they tough it out at first, there's a freedom on the other side of that that is profound, and you don't need to go feeling sorry for them. They have chosen this way of life, and it means something to them, and probably they're loving it more than you can imagine. So I've been doing Bright Line eating now for, like I said, well over a decade. I never deviate from my food plan, and I'm one of the happiest people you'll ever meet. I mean, it's not a hardship to me to eat this way. As a matter of fact, I feel empowered. I feel like I love and care for myself with the food that I eat. I feel integrity that I never had before when I was waking up in the morning, promising myself that I would eat a certain way and then violating it by midday or certainly by the end of the day when I would sit on the couch and just be shoveling food into my face. In those days, I was losing my self-control and my self-integrity and my self-worth, my self-esteem, with every bite that I took because I wanted to be eating this way and I was eating that way. And it was incredibly painful. So although you might worry about us and feel like we've chosen a really hard path, the answer is that it's a path that works for many of us. And you don't need to go feeling sorry for us. We're actually happy with what we're doing. So even though we talk about freedom, there may not be a lot of freedom in the early days. Like I've alluded to with this quitting smoking analogy, it can be very, very challenging in the early days of Bright Line Eating. So I want to explain to you what you might expect with this new path that your loved one has embarked on and what behavior or emotions you might see from them in the early days and physiological reactions as well. It's hard to draw generalizations here because people's experience varies tremendously. But on average, in general, it's typical to see a certain amount of exhaustion, like deep, profound tiredness. And there's many reasons for this physiologically. I think some of it has to do with the fact that many of us, especially in today's society, go through juicing up with caffeine and sugar and ignoring the body's signals to stop, to rest. And we just plow right through those with Starbucks lattes and, just keep going. Well, when people start Bright Line Eating, that caffeine and sugar isn't an option anymore. And so the body sometimes hits a wall where it just finally demands the rest that it's been needing for often many, many years. But also, if the person in your life has weight to lose, then they're on a weight loss food plan, which by definition means they're not getting enough calories to meet their caloric needs, which is why they're losing weight, right? But fat is a very dirty fuel to burn. It's not very clean. And as a matter of fact, the fat cells in the body are the storehouses for all of the toxins that the body stores. So when you shrink those fat cells, literally the vacuoles, which are the biggest parts of the fat cell, dump their contents of toxins straight into the bloodstream, which just leads to a whole bunch of exhaustion. So the person in your life who's doing Bright Line Eating might get very tired, and it might last for quite a while. Usually we see it clear up by about 90 days. There's a huge variety in that. Some people never get tired. Some people feel better after 2 weeks, and some people are exhausted like I was. I was an extreme case. I was exhausted for about 6 months, but some of that was due to an undiagnosed thyroid condition. So I always encourage people who are doing Bright Line Eating to get the advice of their doctors and make sure that their blood work is good, but they might be tired at first. They might be cranky and short-tempered because changing all these habits around food drains the anterior cingulate cortex, which is the seat of willpower. And this is why I don't recommend that people exercise a lot in the early days of Bright Line Eating. Now, the exception to the rule is if they're already a habitual exerciser and it doesn't take any willpower for them to exercise. But I definitely don't recommend that people start an exercise regimen in the early days of Bright Line Eating because the anterior cingulate cortex is drained by changing all these habits, and that leads to all the effects of depleted willpower, which include feeling just worn too thin, short-tempered, sort of the feeling of getting home after a long week on Friday night after sitting in traffic, that feeling when you walk in the door and someone comes at you, honey, what about this bill we have to pay? And then you're like, I just can't even think about that right now. That's how the Bright Line Eating person might feel every day in the early days, is it's too much. I can't deal with this right now. Don't worry, that'll get better. It takes a little while, a month or two, for these new behaviors to start to become habitual, and lots of things will even out at that point. So the more patient you can be with your loved one in the early days of Bright Line Eating, the better. They're not always going to be so crabby. But another challenge is that they might not want to do the things they used to do or go the places that they used to go, because as their willpower is depleted, doing things like going to the movies where they'll be confronted with a snack bar and the waft of the popcorn smell, popcorn's not on their food plan. So it might be that they might say, honey, I don't want to go to the movies for a while. Or they might not want to go to the same parties that they used to go to or the same restaurants. So one thing you can do to be supportive of the person in your life who's doing Bright Line Eating is cut them some slack if they don't want to do the same things they always used to do. Odds are that over the months and years, their repertoire of sort of allowable, permissible, freely engaged in activities will expand back up again. But for a lot of people, not everybody, but for a lot of people who start Bright Line Eating, at the beginning they prefer to narrow the options of what they're doing, like maybe not eat in restaurants at all for a while. And I actually recommend that. Just learn to weigh and measure their food at home and not go out to eat at the beginning. Restaurants are tricky to navigate for someone who does bright line eating. Eventually it becomes second nature, eventually. But in the early days, it'd be helpful if you could be understanding that the range of social activities that they feel comfortable engaging in might be on the narrower side for a little while. And then it's going to be a process of gradually foraying out into those different activities until they build up a level of comfort with them. So that's something else that you might anticipate. So I've already mentioned a couple of the ways that you could be supportive to your friend or loved one who's doing bright line eating. Let me just mention a few more. So there's a bunch of just practical food related things that are helpful. So one thing that you might have noticed is that the bright line eater writes down their food the night before, usually in a little journal that they keep by the fridge, and that's their committed food for the next day. And it would be helpful if you didn't eat up that food before they're eating it the next day. So this might be achieved by asking them to keep their committed food once they've written it down in a special place in the fridge so that you know that that's the food that they're planning to eat for the next day and you don't go eating it on them. It's not the end of the world if you do, but it'd just be nice if once they've written down their food the night before, it's available for them the next day. A similar thing that might be kind of new is the way that you always have cooked food for your loved one. It'd be nice if you'd be open to adjusting that a little bit. Like with bright line eating, we don't freely dump oil all over the pan before cooking up vegetables or meats, for example. So being sensitive to your cooking methods and just ask the person who's doing bright line eating, how would you like me to prepare this? If you're the one in the household who does the cooking, just having an open and frank conversation about, how do you want me to prepare this dish or that dish? What would be easiest for you when it comes to your food plan? Those would be really loving and generous and thoughtful questions to ask of your bright line eater if you're the person who prepares the food or if you're sharing a refrigerator with someone who does bright line eating. And then of course there's thoughtful things that go back to the idea of these foods are like drugs for some of us. So in the same way that you don't invite the known recovering alcoholic to be the bartender at your party. You don't say, hey, John, if you know John's been in AA for 5 years, hey, John, do you want to serve the drinks tonight? That would be sort of a little social faux pas. Well, in the same way, you might not want to ask your bright line eater, hey, would you go buy me a pint of ice cream at the store? Or, you might want to take the pie that has a piece cut out of it already and not leave it out on the counter, wrap it up and put it away out of sight somewhere. I mean, by all means, your food is your food. And I always tell people who are doing bright line eating to keep their eyes on their own plate. So I'm not saying at all that you shouldn't eat whatever foods you want to eat. Like, you're not doing bright line eating. You eat what you want to eat. But if you want to be sensitive and considerate, that's something you might want to think about, is not leaving your desserts or treats out in plain view in the house. Pick a cupboard maybe and just keep them for yourself separate in that cupboard and tell your loved one, hey, I'm just going to keep my food over here. So if you don't want to see it, this is the cupboard door not to open. That would be a really considerate thing to do. The final avenue of support really has to do with supportive attitudes and mindsets, which is just to understand and accept fundamentally that this is something that's really important to the person who's decided to do it. And they probably haven't arrived at this decision lightly, and it probably, sad to say, comes after years and years and years of struggle with their relationship with food. And for many people, when they discover bright line eating, I know it felt this way to me, it felt like a miracle in my life, like a godsend, like something I'd been looking for so many years, and it was finally here in my life. And I know that the people in my immediate family were incredibly supportive when I embarked on this journey, and that meant a whole lot to me. And it didn't mean that they had to love every aspect of it or think that it was a good idea for them or really even agree with it in general, but what it meant is that they respected that this was something that was important to me and that I was really committed to it. And just the fact that they honored that and did their best to learn a little bit about what I was doing meant the world to me. And so I would just invite you to think about it in those terms, even if it seems a little off base to you and a little wacky and quite a bit extreme. just to put yourself in their shoes and recognize that if this is something that really means a lot to them, your support is going to mean a lot to them because you mean a lot to them. So I invite you to adopt that attitude and to also recognize that what this also means is that your reactions to food are probably not a good litmus test to use in trying to figure out how they're reacting to food. Because if you're low or medium on the susceptibility scale, but the person you're thinking of is high on the susceptibility scale, then everything that's ever worked for you and everything that's ever been true for you when it comes to dieting or weight loss or eating the right amount of food or figuring out how to eat healthy foods is probably not going to work for them. It's not going to apply to them because the solutions that have worked for you are not going to be potent enough to handle the obsession and the cravings and the addictions of somebody who is higher on the susceptibility scale. So as we all think of others in terms of what's worked for ourselves, and as you go to make that comparison, just to remember that it may not be apt because your reactions may not apply to their reactions. So in conclusion, I just want to thank you for spending this time with me. My name is Susan Peirce Thompson. I teach a college course on the psychology of eating, and a lot of the ideas that I've presented to you here in this video, like the neuroscience of food addiction in the brain and the susceptibility scale, and the fact that some people's reactions to food are fundamentally different in mind and body than other people's reactions to food. These are the ideas that I present in my college course. And the fact that you're watching this on behalf of your friend or loved one and in service of learning how you might best be supportive to them is just really touching to me. It just means a lot to me. And I want to say thank you for your time. Thank you on their behalf. And thank you for all of us who have reactions to food that are higher on the susceptibility scale, because it means a lot to us when other people take a moment to try to learn what it's like for us and to accept that there is a pathway to freedom for us that really works for us. And we love it when people honor and accept that this is the journey that we have chosen and this is the way we prefer to deal with our food. So thank you for learning a little bit more about that, and thank you for spending this time with me.